Forging a Nation. The Story of the American Revolution. Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. Tensions in the colonies. For a decade, the 13 colonies had simmered under the strain of British rule. Beneath the calm veneer of colonial life, a revolutionary spirit was stirring. In towns and on farms across the colonies, people grumbled at a distant parliament that kept raising taxes and trimming liberties. They demanded the rights of Englishmen, trial by jury, no soldiers quartered in their homes, and, above all, no taxation without representation. For years, the colonists had contested British acts like the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. Each new tax kindled their anger a little more. By 1770, public rage was boiling over. In Boston that March, a mob confronted British soldiers guarding the customs house. Taunting and stones were thrown. Suddenly, a shot rang out. When the smoke cleared on King Street, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American descent. Newspapers seized on the incident, later dubbed the Boston Massacre, and Attucks became a martyr for liberty. The memory of blood in the streets inflamed hearts across the colonies. Anger spread like wildfire. Colonial radicals held secret meetings and organized protests. 3 years later, in December 1773, patriots in disguise staged an even bolder act of defiance. On a cold night, a group of men dressed as Native Americans boarded 3 tea ships docked in Boston Harbor and heaved 342 chests of expensive East India Company tea into the freezing water below. It was called the Boston Tea Party, and it sent shockwaves through the empire. When King George heard of colonists dumping his taxed tea, he was furious. In 1774, his ministers passed the Coercive Acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port, stationing British troops in private homes, and putting Massachusetts under virtual martial law. The American way of life had been openly challenged. In response, colonists from Georgia to New Hampshire began to unite. Committees of correspondence spread news faster than the royal censors could stop them. Leaders like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry rallied their neighbors. In the autumn of 1774, delegates from every colony converged in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. By candlelight, they debated and drafted petitions, demanding that the king restore their rights. They stopped short of declaring outright rebellion, but they vowed to stand together in self-defense. "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately," Benjamin Franklin would later quip, capturing the unity they needed. If Britain's soldiers tried to seize colonial arms or enforce unjust laws by force, the Continental Congress pledged, the colonies would resist as one. The weight of history pressed on their shoulders. For the first time, they felt like a single people ready to defend their liberties. By spring 1775, the tension was unbearable. Rumors raced on horseback and by word of mouth that British troops were marching to seize rebel weapons stored in Massachusetts. Minutemen, citizen soldiers who promised to be ready at a minute's notice, took up their muskets. In every village, farmers, shopkeepers, and traders braced for war. On the eve of April 19th, riders like Paul Revere and William Dawes galloped through the dark countryside, shouting alarm. "The regulars are coming! The regulars are coming!" Even in distant Virginia, a young orator named Patrick Henry would soon thunder, "Give me liberty or give me death," capturing the mood of a people now ready to sacrifice everything for freedom. By dawn, smoke would rise over the Massachusetts landscape. The ingredients of revolution, courage, fear, and resolve, had finally come to a boil. The stage was set for a clash that would change the world. Chapter 2. April 1775. The shot heard round the world. Imagine an April dawn over sleepy Lexington. The morning of April 19th, 1775, arrived with a tense stillness on the village green. It was a quiet Sunday at first, birds chirping, dew on the grass, but the peace shattered with thunder. Carrying lanterns and midnight oil, Paul Revere and other riders had raced through the dark with urgent news. "The regulars are coming!" By sunrise, about 700 British soldiers in scarlet coats had faced a nervous band of 77 Massachusetts militiamen under Captain John Parker. Parker raised his musket and shouted, "Stand your ground! Don't fire unless fired upon!" Hearts pounding, boys and men held their breath. For a moment, the world teetered. Then someone, no one knows who, fired the first shot. Chaos erupted. Muskets cracked from both sides. When the smoke cleared on Lexington Green, 8 Americans were dead or wounded. Among them was a young farmer shot in the throat. The British marched on, but colonial hearts would never be the same. Heartened by no one's warning, the British column continued to Concord, intending to seize hidden stores of gunpowder and weapons. By mid-morning, they began searching homes and barns. They found empty powder kegs. Militiamen had long since moved the guns. Near Northbridge in Concord, a fresh force of patriots had assembled on the wooden span. Colonel James Barrett of Concord walked among them, calm under the sun. British officers demanded the Americans disperse. Barrett stared back and said, "Lay down your arms, for we mean no harm if we are not attacked." Neither side would stand down. Then a single shot rang out. Again, no one knew whose it was. In an instant, a blast of fire leapt from the militia ranks. Dozens of redcoats fell. It was the militia's turn to fire into the disciplined British ranks. That volley shattered the British line, and stunned troops scrambled back toward Boston. By late afternoon, the British retreat had become a nightmare. From every roadside, patriots poured into the fight. Men who had been plowing fields or reading prayer on the Sabbath dropped their plows and Bibles for rifles and axes. From behind fences, walls, trees, and rocky outcroppings, American snipers poured lead into the redcoat flanks. The sound of musketry echoed like a chorus of cannon. British officers struggled to reform their lines as their men staggered under constant fire. Wagon wheels fell apart under bullets. Shouts of "Don't fire!" mixed with screams of wounded men. The countryside had become a deadly gauntlet. By the time the Scarlet Columns limped back into Lexington at dusk, shaken and exhausted, nearly 100 British soldiers were casualties, a staggering toll for a single morning. The King's army had been turned to bloody retreat by farmer citizens in homespun and homespun courage. All across New England, the news raced like wildfire. In Boston, crowds gathered to hear rumors. Had the rebellion just defeated regular troops? In Philadelphia and Charleston, newspapers eagerly reported that Minutemen beat back the soldiers. Everywhere, people realized the war was no longer distant. Sons of patriots were in the fight now. The shot heard round the world had indeed been fired on Lexington Green and the Northbridge in Concord. It meant the American Revolutionary War was in full swing. Families hugged each other tightly. Virginians, Carolinians, and New Yorkers huddled by fireplaces, wondering if they too might soon have to take up arms. One thing was clear: there would be no returning to the old normal. A new chapter had opened with the staccato of musket fire and the cries of the wounded. The cause of liberty was being tested in blood. Chapter 3. June 1775. Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston. By June 1775, the British troops were bottled up in Boston, surrounded by thousands of armed patriots. The raid at Lexington and Concord had shown colonial passion, and towns of New England bristled like hornets around Boston Harbor. Colonial commanders knew they must strike before the King's army could recover. Under cover of darkness on June 16th, some 1,200 American militiamen under Colonel William Prescott stealthily marched onto Breed's Hill in Charlestown. They worked through the night, shoveling earth, building a log redoubt and trenches. By dawn's first light on June 17th, a stout earthen breastwork crowned Breed's Hill, pointing its captured cannon at the city of Boston. General William Howe was furious. He ordered wave after wave of British regulars to charge the heights. The redcoats advanced up the slippery slope in formation, smoke from their muskets blending with morning fog. The American militiamen held their fire until the enemy was very close. "Hold your fire until you see the whites of their eyes!" Prescott shouted. At that command, the trap was sprung. American muskets flashed, and a torrent of lead rippled through the British ranks. The first assault shattered against the ramparts. Dozens of redcoats lay dead or wounded. Undeterred, Howe rallied fresh regiments and sent them in again. Again, the Patriot riflemen opened up at point-blank range, mowing down the King's best. A second British column piled up like cordwood at the redoubt's edge, and still the colonials stood firm. By the third assault, American bullets had mostly spent, and soon they began running low on powder. The third British attack was ferocious. Bayonets and clubs surged over the breastworks. Pike and musket ramrod rammed into trench. Outmatched and out of ammunition, the Patriots finally fell back, retreating toward the trees to carry off their wounded. Blood covered the ground as the British at last occupied the hill. It was a costly victory for them. When the smoke cleared, over 1,000 British casualties lay on the field, nearly twice as many as the Americans suffered. Among the dead was Dr. Joseph Warren, a Boston physician and Patriot leader who had risen as a volunteer to fight and became one of the Revolution's first martyrs. News of Bunker Hill spread through America like wildfire. Colonists learned that raw militias had stood toe-to-toe with the world's mightiest army and not crumbled. The cheap and homemade American gunfire had made King George's soldiers bleed. Across the colonies, ordinary citizens felt an electric thrill. If farmers could kill disciplined redcoats, then just maybe they could win this war. While Boston remained under siege, the British still held the harbor but no man's land outside. The Revolution's spirit soared. Men who had been on the fence were now convinced they had a fighting chance. The cost of victory was paid in blood, but the resolve of the Patriots was hardened. As one New Englander exclaimed later, "We have fire and fury enough to make an ending." The road ahead would be long, but Breed's Hill had proved that the journey was possible. Chapter 4. Washington takes command, 1775. In Philadelphia that summer, leaders of the colonies were anxiously watching the unfolding war. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that concerted, disciplined leadership was desperately needed. On July 3, 1775, the Continental Congress took action. In near-unanimous vote, delegates named a single commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, George Washington of Virginia. When word reached the North, men cheered. Washington was a tall, dignified soldier and planter, a veteran of the French and Indian War, known for his calm courage. He arrived on horseback outside Boston a few days later. He found thousands of militiamen camped on the frozen fields around the city. Brave but undisciplined volunteers, short on shoes and winter coats. Washington wasted no time. He imposed strict regimentation. Drilling from dawn till dusk, he taught the men how to stand in rank and reload their muskets in a fraction of the old time. He punished thieves and drunkards to restore order. He begged the Congress in Philadelphia for food, uniforms, and blankets, emphasizing the lives on the line. Around the camps, American flags were sewn by local women, and tents were arranged in neat rows. Under Washington's steady hand, the ragged Patriot Army began to transform into something like a real army. All autumn, Washington's soldiers sat in the snow-covered hills, watching the redcoats slog behind their defensive lines. Washington built more earthworks, even as his men raided supply trains of the British Navy along the coast. It was a tense, hungry siege. Despite hardships, the men's respect for Washington grew. His unyielding patience and stamina set a standard. Officers recalled that in freezing weather he often walked barefoot among the huts, sharing the men's discomfort. The rebels had a strong presence leading them now. But the war was far from over. Washington's orders were clear: stay ready and hold the line. The common people took heart. The fight was no longer in one distant part of the colonies, and now every colony could feel it was their cause too. Chapter 5. March 1776. The British evacuate Boston. While Washington drilled his army around Boston, a new chapter was unfolding in 1776. The Continental Congress still hoped for reconciliation, but the King's ministry ordered a full-scale invasion of America. Ignoring the snow and mud, on March 2, 1776, Colonel Henry Knox triumphantly brought in what many thought impossible: captured British artillery from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Knox's men had hauled dozens of cannons, once hauled from Fort Ticonderoga by Ethan Allen, across hundreds of miles of snow and ice. By early March, those heavy guns were in position on the high ground of Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. British General Howe stared in disbelief. The colonists now had the power to rain destruction onto the city. On the night of March 16th, the British prepared to flee. Under cover of darkness and a thick fog, more than 9,000 British soldiers, sailors, and Loyalist refugees packed onto 120 ships in the harbor. Before sunrise on March 17th, the Redcoats sailed out of Boston, abandoning their redoubt. American sentries stepped forward with bayonets, ready to stop them, but found the city already empty. Drums and fifes had alerted the patriots. In Philadelphia, bells rang out in celebration. Washington's plan had worked. By the next morning, General Washington marched triumphantly into Boston, the city he had laid siege to for nearly a year. The bloodless capture of Boston was an enormous boost to patriot morale. Ordinary citizens watched as their militia marched down the main street and crowded on the hillsides as Americans fired a salute. Even anti-British newspapers printed, "We, by the grace of heaven, have succeeded in the bloodless reduction of a great town." But they also knew Britain still had massive armies in New York and elsewhere. The British were wounded, but not beaten. Both sides quietly prepared for the next phase of this great experiment. Boston was free, for now, but the revolutionary journey was only beginning. Chapter 6. The New York Campaign, 1776. The tide turned swiftly. The British cabinet, having lost Boston, soon focused on New York. A huge invasion force sailed to Staten Island that summer. Washington rushed his army down from Boston, but he had only a few thousand poorly trained troops to face more than 34,000 of Britain's finest soldiers and hired Hessian mercenaries. The stage was set for a catastrophic clash. On August 27, 1776, the British launched a devastating attack on Long Island, Brooklyn. American militia and Continentals, many still in homespun, were outmaneuvered. The British column outflanked them through Jamaica Pass. The New York sunlight that day was heavy with musket smoke and screams. The Continental line was broken. Desperate fighting raged, but the Patriots could not hold. The Americans suffered nearly 1,000 casualties, including prisoners. Washington realized the city was lost. In a miraculous stroke, under cover of darkness and a fog on August 29th, he ferried the entire army across the East River to Manhattan. British cannons roared all night, but the rebel army was gone, saved only by stealth and luck. New York City fell next. Howe pursued Washington into Manhattan and below, forcing retreats through the Bronx and down toward New Jersey. Fierce skirmishes at White Plains and Fort Washington cost more American lives and prisoners. By early November, the Continentals were ejected from New York altogether. Washington conducted a skillful retreat across New Jersey, fighting delaying actions at Germantown and elsewhere. He ordered bridges and supplies burned to slow the British advance. Everywhere the Patriots went, they destroyed roads and bridges behind them. By December, the retreat had carried Washington's army over 250 miles. They settled in Pennsylvania, desperate and worn. The Continental Army had dwindled to around 2,000 men, as enlistments ran out and many deserted. Some counties raised new militia, but they were untested. Washington wrote grimly, I think the game is pretty near up. In Colonel Joseph Reed's words, the cause of liberty seemed at its nadir. The soaring hopes after Boston had turned to dread, yet Washington refused to admit defeat. By burning his boats at places like Trenton, he signaled his determination to fight on. He knew morale must be rebuilt, or the revolution itself could collapse. Chapter 7. Winter, 1776 to 1777. Crossing the Delaware, Trenton, and Princeton. Just when all seemed lost, Washington made a bold decision that would revive the cause. On Christmas night, 1776, he led about 2,400 men in a daring operation across the ice-choked Delaware River near McConkey's Ferry. It was a howling nor'easter. Sleet and snow lashed the men as they waded into up to their shoulders. Huge chunks of floating ice struck the sides of the boats. But Washington's gamble paid off. By the morning of December 26th, the army had formed quietly on the New Jersey shore. Their target was Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessian forces there, commanded by Colonel Johann Rau, had been billeted across the town. After their Christmas celebrations and too much rum, the Hessians were stunned by the dawn attack. Patriot columns moved into place and opened fire in well-coordinated lines. The Hessians tried to form up on King Street, but soon collapsed under the American onslaught. Street by street and house by house, the victory was complete by midday. Over 900 Hessians surrendered, with only 2 Americans killed. Trenton exploded in cheers. Soldiers danced in the snow and rode home with glee. The revolution was alive again. Washington did not stop there. He decided to strike Princeton before the British could muster reinforcements. On January 3, 1777, he left behind campfires at Trenton and slipped away with fresh forces. In the pre-dawn hours, the Americans marched around the flanks of a British outpost at Princeton. At dawn, they attacked. In a short but furious fight near a small church, the Continentals routed the remaining British troops. More prisoners fell into Patriot hands. By early afternoon, Trenton and Princeton were both in American hands. These 2 victories had stunned the British High Command. In 2 weeks, Washington's frigid gambit had turned despair into hope. Men flocked to join the ranks. Fishermen left their boats, blacksmiths dropped their hammers, and even some loyalists began to question if the crown could truly prevail. The soldiers of fortune saw new strength in the cause of liberty. December's icy miracles had saved the Continental Army and kept the revolution breathing. Chapter 8. July 1776. The Declaration of Independence. While Washington won these field victories, even bigger events were unfolding in Philadelphia. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress boldly voted that the colonies were free and independent states. 2 days later, on July 4th, delegates approved the final wording of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's stirring phrases were read aloud in Independence Hall. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The words gave voice to the fury and ideals of the colonists. By declaring independence, the new nation no longer aimed just to resist abuses. It proclaimed itself a sovereign country. The reaction was electric. Crowds in Philadelphia erupted in cheer. Bells were rung and militia danced in the streets. News spread quickly by rider and pamphlet. In small towns and on frontier farms, Americans gathered to read the Declaration by lamplight. Its ideal of liberty resonated even in remote hills. It was no longer just about taxes. The Americans now claimed rights to life and happiness themselves. The Declaration made every signatory a traitor to Britain, and many risked their lives to sign it. But for ordinary patriots, it gave a new purpose. Thomas Paine's earlier pamphlet, Common Sense, January 1776, had already argued for independence. Now Paine's arguments were realized. The Declaration's promise that tyranny must end gave countless colonists the courage to keep fighting. King George took note immediately. With this act, reconciliation was off the table. The war had become total, yet in the Continental Congress's eyes, an idea had been sown that was worth any cost. As one Virginia delegate marveled later, "The flame of liberty started in our own county has spread on both sides of the Atlantic." But bricks of reality also fell. Once independence was declared, the British would fight even harder. Philadelphia would soon be in danger. As Washington regrouped his forces in Pennsylvania that winter, he knew these powerful words needed to be defended by the sword. The cause was now noble and personal for every patriot. Chapter 9, 1777 to 1778. Turning Point, Saratoga and the French Alliance. The year 1777 brought the struggle to a crescendo. The British believed a knockout blow was still possible. They launched a three-part plan. In the north, General John Burgoyne would lead an army down from Canada toward Albany. In the middle, General William Howe would march from New York City to capture Philadelphia, the American capital. A third force under General St-Leger would move east from Lake Ontario. If these three forces joined, New England could be cut off. Early on, Burgoyne had success. He recaptured Fort Ticonderoga and advanced into the wooded Hudson Valley. But supply lines and Indian support soon proved difficult. On September 11, 1777, Howe struck at Washington at Brandywine Creek, defeating him and capturing Philadelphia a few weeks later. Congress fled the occupied capital, but Washington's army escaped to regroup in valley forts. In upstate New York, however, Burgoyne's campaign faltered. On September 19th at Freeman's Farm, near Saratoga, Burgoyne blundered into a strong American position. General Horatio Gates, reinforced by riflemen under Daniel Morgan and others, ambushed him in the forest. Burgoyne's troops held on but were drained by musket fire from hidden sharpshooters. Reinforcements in October did not break the trap. On October 7th at Bemis Heights, Benedict Arnold, acting without orders, led a furious American charge that shattered the exhausted British. With supplies nearly gone and surrounded by 16,000 rebels, Burgoyne had no choice. On October 17th, he surrendered all 5,800 of his men to Gates. The victory at Saratoga was a revolution within a revolution. News of the surrender electrified the patriots and stunned King George's courts. It convinced France that the Americans could indeed win independence. By February 1778, France formally recognized the United States and declared war on Britain. Spain, eager to take Gibraltar and regain Florida, also joined the war against Britain in 1779, though not formally allying with America. Now Britain faced enemies across the globe, from the Caribbean to India. The Revolutionary War had become a world war. For Americans, the French alliance was a dream come true. French ships and troops began to arrive. The patriotic troops wrote home that Europe had taken their side at last. Orchestras played French tunes, and the Marquis de Lafayette returned to campaign alongside Washington, his youthful spirit inspiring many. On the battlefield, Americans believed Providence had finally smiled on them. But the price of this great aid was war, not peace. The patriots steeled themselves. Their struggle was not over, but they now fought with the world watching, and, crucially, with mighty French muskets at their backs. Chapter 10. Winter 1777 to 1778, Valley Forge and Renewal. With the British focused elsewhere, Washington's exhausted army settled into winter quarters. In December 1777, the Continentals marched into camp at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles outside Philadelphia. Snow and ice soon transformed the camp into a frozen hell. The men had to build makeshift log cabins and scramble for blankets. One of Washington's aides, Matthew Clarkson, later described it. "Our people are in a fine condition, some barefooted, many without stockings or shoes, and all dearly longing for spring. There are 3 fires to a hut, and their dress is in rags. Frostbite and disease stalked the lines. By spring 1778, nearly 2,500 men would die from cold or sickness, without a single musket fired in battle." One soldier later wrote, "Such a scene of misery as I beheld, God only knows." Washington himself shared their suffering. He was often seen in an officer's cottage, washing smallpox among his men so others would not catch it. One morning, he reportedly cut the gaiters off a soldier's overused boots, asking officers for shoes for his men. All through that grim winter, he inspected encampments and urged Congress to send aid. But Valley Forge, harsh as it was, became a turning point in spirit. In February, the Continental Army received its first regular drill master from abroad, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian nobleman experienced in modern warfare. In freezing drill fields, von Steuben whipped the disordered armies into shape. They learned to march in European formations, to stand at shoulder arms and reload their muskets in just 30 seconds. The once haphazard lines grew tall and synchronized. The Marquis de Lafayette, by then a general, raised morale by tirelessly volunteering in the cold and even standing guard with the men. Women like Martha Washington and others organized larders and sewed clothing in makeshift workshops. By spring 1778, the army had been transformed. On June 19, 1778, in the first warm sunlight of summer, Washington reviewed about 12,000 troops in neat lines on the picket plains of Valley Forge. These were no longer starving lads in homemade jackets. They were now a lean, hardy force of disciplined soldiers, ready for the next battle. Fresh from Valley Forge, Washington saw his chance when the British finally left Philadelphia in the summer. The war in the North resumed in June 1778 at Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey. On a sweltering June afternoon, about 10,000 Continentals met Sir Henry Clinton's 11,000-man army as it withdrew to New York. The hottest battle of the war ensued, firing muskets under a blazing sun. It ended without a clear victor, but proved one thing. The Americans now stood toe-to-toe with British regulars. One colorful legend from Monmouth survives. Mary Molly Hayes Macaulay, nicknamed Molly Pitcher, reportedly carried water to suffering gunners in the heat. When her husband collapsed at a cannon, she took his place at the gun. Whether myth or truth, the tale embodied the grit of revolution. After Monmouth, the British decided to concentrate back in New York City, effectively leaving the northern colonies to America. The war's focus now turned south and west. Chapter 11, 1778 to 1781, the Southern Campaign. In late 1778, with the North in stalemate and the French at sea, Britain struck at the southern colonies. They believed pockets of loyalists in Georgia and the Carolinas would help them. British armies and fleets landed in Savannah, Georgia in December 1778. By early 1779, Lincoln had been captured and Savannah was held by the Crown. In 1780, a huge British force under General Sir Henry Clinton attacked Charleston, South Carolina. After a siege in May 1780, some 5,000 American soldiers under General Benjamin Lincoln were forced to surrender. It was the Revolution's worst American defeat. The British then swept north through the Carolinas, winning a crushing victory at Camden in August 1780 against General Horatio Gates. British regulars and their loyalist allies believed they had tamed the South. Many patriots were demoralized. Farmers fled inland, towns emptied. Yet this was when Southern Americans showed stubborn resilience. In September 1780, militia from the mountains mobilized. Over 1,000 over-mountain men of the Appalachians, frontiersmen from today's Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas, marched to confront Major Patrick Ferguson, who had been terrorizing the Carolinas. On October 7th, at Kings Mountain, North Carolina, the over-mountain militia surrounded Ferguson's loyalists on a rocky ridge. In fierce, close-range fighting, Patriot sharpshooters poured deadly fire into the Loyalists. By nightfall, the British Loyalists were overwhelmed. Ferguson was killed. This watershed Patriot victory broke British momentum. Cornwallis would later admit that Kings Mountain was the turn of the Southern tide. General Nathaniel Greene then took command of the Southern Continental Forces in late 1780. He fought a war of maneuver and attrition, avoiding straight lines with the vastly larger British army. Greene split his tiny force, wearing down the enemy. He also had help from skillful subordinates. In January 1781, General Daniel Morgan drew Cornwallis's cavalry colonel, Banastre Tarleton, into a brilliant trap at Cowpens, South Carolina. Morgan arrayed his troops so that exhausted militia feigned a retreat, luring Tarleton's dragoons forward. Then hidden line infantry crashed in from the flanks. Within minutes, Tarleton's force was routed with heavy losses. That victory forced Cornwallis to withdraw into North Carolina and later Virginia. Meanwhile, another patriot waged guerrilla war. Brigadier General Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, prowled the South Carolina swamps with his small band of riflemen. His men struck supply lines and British outposts by night, then melted into the cypress thickets. The British called him a ghost. Cornwallis had to dedicate troops to hunt Marion, spreading the enemy thin. Each battle in the South now drained Britain's resources. In March 1781, Greene finally squared off with Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse, Greensboro, North Carolina. The Americans were badly outnumbered, but Greene set a trap. Patriot riflemen and militia formed labyrinth defense lines, throwing off the enemy's advance line by line. The fighting was fierce. Technically, the British took the field, but at a devastating cost. They lost over 25% of their army. Cornwallis wrote it was one of the hardest battles I ever fought. Weakened and sick, the British general decided to move to Virginia to gather loyalist support. In doing so, Cornwallis unwittingly marched into Washington's next plan. By mid-1781, the momentum in the South belonged to Greene and the Patriots. The British gambit of Southern conquest had ultimately unraveled the Crown's position. Chapter 12. October 1781. Yorktown, the final siege. The pieces now were in place for an epic finale. Cornwallis had set up at Yorktown, Virginia, expecting more men and ships. What he found instead was doom. In early September 1781, a powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse entered the Chesapeake Bay. The French warships chased away the small British squadron, seizing control of the bay's entrance. Cornwallis was now trapped between Washington's army to the north and the sea behind him, with no Royal Navy to rescue him. Washington seized the moment. He secretly moved his 8,000 Continentals south from New York, joined by 7,000 French soldiers under General Rochambeau, the Marquis de Lafayette among them. By September 28th, the combined French and American force of about 17,000 had encircled Yorktown, as 3,000 French Marines cut off Cornwallis by sea. Siege works sprang up on the peninsula. Cannon roared night and day as French and American artillery pounded the British defenses. British barracks and redoubts gradually collapsed under the bombardment. On October 14th, Washington ordered one final assault on the British inner works. French and American soldiers charged forward. In the smoke and terror, British defenses were overrun. One by one, the redoubts fell. Cornwallis, his army now surrounded and battered, accepted the inevitable. On October 17th, he asked for terms. 2 days later, October 19th, 1781, he formally surrendered. In a moment dignified and strange, General Cornwallis did not attend the surrender ceremony himself, sending his second-in-command. In silence, British colors were lowered. American and French flags were raised. Washington accepted Cornwallis's sword on his behalf in a humble gesture. As trumpets sounded and a thankful hush fell over the Allied troops, the world seemed to change. For the first time, it looked as if American independence was in hand. The Revolution's long nightmare was ending. Soldiers embraced and wept. Citizens in Philadelphia danced and fired cannon in salute. Across the ocean in London, stunned ministers finally conceded that continued war was impossible. The British Parliament voted to begin peace talks. In America, Washington told his officers, "The great contest is ended. The enemy do not stand the test of battle, while our country stands in need of more defenders than we have to supply." Yorktown was the triumph America had bled for, the victory that realized the dream of liberty. Chapter 13. 1783. Treaty of Paris and the Birth of a Nation. It would take 2 more years of negotiation to make peace official. British troops still held some strong points like New York City, but back home the war was widely despised. Britain was at war with France, Spain, and the Netherlands as a result of the conflict, and the cost was mounting. Eventually, King George's government decided it could no longer fight. In 1782, preliminary agreements were signed, and on September 3, 1783, representatives of the United States and King George III met in Paris. The Treaty of Paris ended the war. In it, Britain formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation, with generous boundaries, the Mississippi River to the west, the Great Lakes to the north, and the 31st parallel to Spanish Florida. These terms astonished people back in America. News of the treaty brought unbridled joy. In Philadelphia, bells tolled and cannons boomed from the ramparts. Citizens in every state held parades, dances, and Thanksgiving feasts. Flags with 13 stars and stripes flew defiantly from homes and town halls. The words, United States of America, finally had concrete meaning. 13 states now stood together free from Britain's rule. In November 1783, George Washington received a new commission to suppress any further fighting. But in December he publicly disbanded the army at New York, and 2 weeks later he resigned his command and returned to civilian life. Standing before Congress, he said simply, "I now relinquish every power, but the power of giving thanks to Almighty God." America's first commander-in-chief became its first citizen. The revolution had done more than change borders. It changed minds. A nation of former colonies had proven that the great experiment of self-government could succeed. Ideas written into the Declaration, that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, became the moral foundation of the new republic. These beliefs spread abroad, inspiring millions. Back home, Americans of every walk of life felt pride and possibility. Farmers who had cast a ballot for the first time, women who had managed homes and economies, black soldiers like James Lafayette, a brave spy at Yorktown, who had fought for freedom. Yet the new nation faced heavy tasks ahead, forming a union, repaying war debts, addressing the paradox of slavery under a Declaration of Liberty. For the moment, however, those worries were set aside. The war was won. After 8 long years, the frontiers were finally safe from attack. The economy could breathe, and independence was real. The curtain fell on a drama in which ordinary people had become heroes. The American Revolutionary War had been a journey of immense sacrifice, suspense, and hope. In its fiery crucible, a country was born, forged by struggle, bound together by ideals, and destined to chart a new course in history. The ship of state, shattered and rebuilt, at last set sail on the seas of freedom.